regions of ancient Greece were areas identified by the ancient Greeks as geographical subdivisions of the Hellenic world. These regions are described in the works of ancient historians and geographers, and in the legends and myths of the ancient Greeks. Conceptually, there is no clear theme to the structure of these regions. Some, particularly in the Peloponnese, can be seen primarily as distinct geophysical units, defined by physical boundaries such as mountain ranges and rivers. These regions retained their identity, even when the identity of the people living there changed during the Greek Dark Ages. Conversely, the division of central Greece between Boeotia, Phacelia, Doris and the three parts of Locris cannot be understood as a logical division by physical boundaries, and instead seems to follow ancient tribal divisions. Nevertheless, these regions also survived the upheaval of the Greek Dark Ages, showing that they had acquired less political connotations. Outside the Peloponnese and central Greece, geographical divisions and identities did change over time, suggesting a closer connection with tribal identity. Over time, however, all the regions also acquired geopolitical meanings, and political bodies uniting the cities of a region became common in the classical period. These traditional subdivisions of Greece form the basis for the modern system of regional units of Greece. However, there are important differences, with many of the smaller ancient regions not represented in the current system. To fully understand the ancient history of Greece therefore requires more detailed description of the ancient regions. Greece proper. Central Greece. Akarnania was a small district to the south of Thessaly. The regions of Akarnania and Otia were closely linked, both occupying the valley of the Marsyas river, with Akarnania occupying the lower ground to the north, and Otia the higher ground south of the river. The boundaries of these two regions were formed by the arc of high ground running west from Mount Oeta round to Mount Timphristis, then north round to the headwaters of Spercheios, and then east to the western spur of Mount Othrys. The lowland border in the Spercheios valley with Malis ran approximately north-south along from Oeta to the western spur of Othrys. During the Archaic and Classical periods, the Akarnanians were members of the Delphian Amphictyonic League, and shared 2 votes on the Amphictyonic Council with the Otians. Attica. The name of Attica was said to be derived from Atthis, daughter of Cranors, who was said to have been the second king of Athens. Attica is bounded on the east by the Aegean Sea, on the west by Megaris and the Saronic Gulf, and on the north by Boeotia. It is separated from Boeotia by a range of mountains. In the Archaic and Classical periods, the Atticans were members of the Delphian Amphictyonic League, and shared the two Ionian votes on the Amphictyonic Council with the Euboeans. Boeotia. The region of Boeotia, along with many of the cities that existed there in the Classical period, is described in the Catalogue of Ships in the Iliad. In the Archaic and Classical periods, the Boeotians were members of the Delphian Amphictyonic League, and had 2 votes on the Amphictyonic Council. Doris. In the Archaic and Classical periods, the Dorians were members of the Delphian Amphictyonic League, and shared the 2 Dorian votes on the Amphictyonic Council with the Laconian Dorians. Euboea. In the Archaic and Classical periods, the Euboeans were members of the Delphian Amphictyonic League, and shared the 2 Ionian votes on the Amphictyonic Council with the Athenians. Locris. The region of Locris, primarily the eastern part, is described in the Iliad. In the Archaic and Classical periods, the Locrians were members of the Delphian Amphictyonic League, and had 2 votes on the Amphictyonic Council. Milis. In the Archaic and Classical periods, the Malians were members of the Delphian Amphictyonic League, and had 2 votes on the Amphictyonic Council. Megaris. Otia was a small upland district located south of Thessaly. It was closely linked with the district of Akarnania, sharing a location in the valley of the Spercheios. The Otians were members of the Delphian Amphictyonic League, and shared 2 votes on the Amphictyonic Council with the Aenians. Phacelia, the region of Phacelia, along with some of the cities that existed there in the classical period, is described in the Iliad. In the Archaic and Classical periods, the Phocians were members of the Delphian Amphictyonic League, and had 2 votes on the Amphictyonic Council, until they were stripped of them after the Third Sacred War. Western Greece. Akarnania. Akarnania is a region of west-central Greece that lies along the Ionian Sea, west of Aetolia, with the Achelous River for a boundary, and north of the Gulf of Calydon, which is the entrance to the Gulf of Corinth. Today it forms the western part of the regional unit of Aetolia. Akarnania. The capital and principal city in ancient times was Stratos. The north side of Akarnania of the Corinthian Gulf was considered part of the region of Epirus. Akarnania's foundation in Greek mythology was traditionally ascribed to Akarnan, son of Alcmaeon. Aetolia. The Achelous River separates Aetolia from Akarnania to the west. On the north it had boundaries with Epirus and Thessaly, on the east with the Ozolian Locrians, and on the south the entrance to the Corinthian Gulf defined the limits of Aetolia. In classical times Aetolia comprised 2 parts. Old Aetolia in the west, from the Achelous to the Evenus and Calydon, and New Aetolia or acquired Aetolia in the east, from the Evenus and Calydon to the Ozolian Locrians. The country has a level and fruitful coastal region, but an unproductive and mountainous interior. The mountains contained many wild beasts, and acquired fame in Greek mythology as the scene of the hunt for the Calydonian boar. Apyrantia. Ancient Apyrantia was a small region of Aetolia, south of Dolopia. Dolopia is a mountainous region of Greece, located north of Aetolia. The Dolopians were members of the Delphian Amphictyonic League, and shared 2 votes on the Amphictyonic Council with the Periboi. Peloponnese. The Peloponnese or Peloponnesos is a large peninsula at the southern tip of the Balkans, and part of the traditional heartland of Greece. It is joined to the Greek mainland by the Isthmus of Corinth. The Peloponnese is conventionally divided into 7 regions, which remain in use as regional units of modern Greece. Most of these regions are directly named in the catalogue of ships in the Iliad, suggesting that this geographic division of the Peloponnese is very ancient, and stretches back to Mycenaean Greece. Achaea. Geographically, Achaea was the northernmost region of the Peloponnese, occupying the coastal strip north of Arcadia. To the south, it bordered Arcadia along the ridge of high ground running from Mount Erymanthos to Mount Selene. To the east, it bordered Corinthia near to the city of Sicyon, and to the west the Larissos River and western ridge of Erymanthos formed the border with Elis. Apart from the plain around Dyme, to the west, Achaea was generally a mountainous region. The origin of the name of Achaea is somewhat problematic. Homer uses the term Achaeans as a generic term for Greeks throughout the Iliad. Conversely, a distinct region of Achaea is not mentioned. The region now known as Achaea is instead referred to as Aegialis. Pausanias says that Achaean was the name of those Greeks originally inhabiting the Argolis and Laconia, because they were descended from the sons of the mythical Achaeus, Archander and Architellus. However, this is clearly not the manner in which Homer uses the term. Pausanias also recounts the legend that the Achaeans were forced out of their lands in the Argolid by the Dorians during the legendary Dorian invasion of the Peloponnese. As a consequence, the Achaeans went to Aegialis and forced the Aegialians out of their land. The Ionians took temporary refuge in Athens, and Aegialis became known as Achaea. It was supposedly for this reason that the region known as Achaea in classical Greece did not correspond to the Homeric usage. Herodotus recounted more or less the same story, showing that, whatever its veracity, it was deeply embedded in Greek legend. Achaea was later used by the Romans as a name for the province covering much of central and southern Greece. The name Achaea was later used in the Crusader state of the Principality of Achaea, which consisted of the whole Peloponnese. thus more closely following Roman usage. There is a modern regional unit of Greece of the same name as the ancient region, which is largely based on the ancient region. Arcadia. Geographically, ancient Arcadia occupied the highlands at the center of the Peloponnese. To the north, it bordered Achaea along the ridge of high ground running from Mount Erymanthos to Mount Selene. Most of Mount Akarnania lay within Arcadia. To the east, it had borders with Argolis and Corinthia along the ridge of high ground running from Mount Selene round to Mount Ologyrtis and then south Mount Parthenius. To the south, the border Laconia and Messenia ran through the foothills of the Parnon and Taygetus mountain ranges, such that Arcadia contained all the headwaters of the Alpheus River, but none of the Eurotas River. To the southwest, the border with Messenia ran along the tops of Mount Nomia and Mount Helium, and from there the border with Elis ran along the valleys of the Erymanthos and Diagon rivers. Due to its remote, mountainous character, Arcadia seems to have been a cultural refuge. When, during the Greek Dark Age, Doric Greek dialects were introduced to the Peloponnese, the older language apparently survived in Arcadia, and formed part of the Arcado-Cypriot group of Greek languages. Herodotus says that the inhabitants of Arcadia were Pelasgians, the Greek name for the supposed indigenous inhabitants of Greece, who dwelt there before the arrival of the Hellenic tribes. Whilst Herodotus seems to have found the idea that the Pelasgians were not Greek far-fetched, it is clear that the Arcadians were considered as the original inhabitants of the region. Arcadia is one of the regions described in the catalogue of ships in the Iliad. Agamemnon himself gave Arcadia the ships for the Trojan War because Arcadia did not have a navy. There is a modern regional unit of Greece of the same name, which is more extensive than the ancient region. Argolis. Ancient Argolis occupied the eastern part of the Peloponnesus, primarily the Argolid Peninsula, together with the coastal region to the east of Arcadia, and north of Laconia. To the north, the boundary with the territory of Corinth was rather more fluid, and these territories have sometimes been considered together. For instance, Pausanias discussed Argolis and Corinthia together in one book of his description of Greece. Similarly, in modern Greece, a prefecture of Argolido-Corinthia has existed at various times. Argolis took its name from the principal city of the region during the Archaic and Classical periods, Argos. Argolis is discussed in the catalogue of ships of the Iliad, without being given that explicit name. But the major cities of the region are listed together under the leadership of Diomedes. There is a modern regional unit of Greece of the same name, occupying a smaller area than the ancient region. Corinthia. The territory associated with the city of ancient Corinth in ancient Greece lay on either side of the Isthmus of Corinth. On the northern side of the isthmus, it was bounded by Mount Geranea, which separated it from Megaris. On the Peloponnesian side of the isthmus, Corinthia was bounded by Achaea to the west, and to the south by the territory of Argolis. As discussed above, the boundary between Argolis and Corinthia was rather fluid, and in both ancient and modern times, the regions have been considered together. Corinthia is discussed in the catalogue of ships of the Iliad, without being given that explicit name. But the major cities of the region are listed together under the leadership of Agamemnon. There is a modern regional unit of Greece of the same name, Elis. Elis occupied the western, and flattest part of the Peloponnese. To the northeast, it bordered Achaea along the Larissos River and western spur of Erymanthos. And the east, the border with Arcadia ran along the Erymanthos and Diagon rivers to Mount Helium. From the Helium, its border with Messenia ran along the Nida River to the sea. Elis is discussed in the catalogue of ships of the Iliad, without being given that explicit name. But the major cities of the region are listed together. There is a modern regional unit of Greece with the same name, Laconia. Laconia occupied the southeastern part of the Peloponnese. Its principal boundaries were formed by the Parnon and Taygetus mountain ranges. Its western boundary, adjoining Messenia, ran along the Koskarica River from just south of the city of Abia, up into the Taygetus Range, and then north along the Taygetus Ridge. The northern border with Arcadia ran amongst the foothills of Taygetus and Parnon, such that Upper Laconia included all the headwaters of the Eurotas River. To the northeast of the Parnon Range was the coastal area of Sinuria. This was originally part of the Argolid, but by the Classical period had become part of Laconia. The land between the Taygetus and Parnon ranges formed the heart of Laconia. The coastal region east of Parnon, and south of Sinuria was also part of Laconia. Lacedaemon is one of the regions described in the Catalogue of Ships, in the Iliad. In the Archaic and Classical periods, the Laconians were members of the Delphian Amphictyonic League, and shared the two Dorian votes on the Amphictyonic Council with the Dorians from Doris. There is a modern regional unit of Greece of the same name. During the Classical period, Laconia was dominated by the city of Sparta. There were other settlements in the region, and most inhabitants were not full Spartan citizens, but Lacedaemonians or Perioecia. However, all these citizens and towns were part of the Spartan state. Only after the final eclipse of Spartan power after the war against Nabis did the rest of Laconia become free from Spartan domination. However, Laconia instead fell under the domination of the Achaean League until the whole of the Peloponnese was conquered by the Romans in 146 BC. Messenia occupied the southwestern part of the Peloponnese. To the north it had a border with Elis along the Nida River, from whence the border with Arcadia ran along the tops of Mount Helium and Mount Nomia. The northern border with Arcadia then ran amongst the foothills of Taygetus, but all the headwater of the Alpheus River lay outside Messenia. The eastern border with Laconia ran along the Taygetus Ridge up to the Koskarica River, and then along that river to the sea, near the city of Abia. There is a modern regional unit of Greece of the same name, Phacelia. The Thessalians were members of the Delphian Amphictyonic League, and had two votes on the Amphictyonic Council. Achaea Thyatus. The Theotic Achaeans were members of the Delphian Amphictyonic League, and had two votes on the Amphictyonic Council. Magnesia. The Magnetes were members of the Delphian Amphictyonic League, and had two votes on the Amphictyonic Council. Hysteriotus. Pelasgotus. Peribia. The Periboi were members of the Delphian Amphictyonic League, and shared two votes on the Amphictyonic Council with the Dolopians. Thessaliatis. Epirus. Athemania. Chauna or Chaon was the name of the northwestern part of Epirus, the homeland of the Greek tribe of the Charonians. Its main town was called Phoenice. According to Virgil, Chaon was the eponymous ancestor of the Charonians. Daceretia Molossus. The Molossians were an ancient Greek tribal state that inhabited the region of Epirus since the Mycenaean era. On their northeast frontier, they had the Charonians, and on their southern frontier the kingdom of the Thesprotians. To their north were the Illyrians. Thesprotia. Paroia was an ancient Greek region in Epirus. Tymphia. Macedonia. Macedonia or Macedon was an ancient kingdom, centered in the northeastern part of the Greek peninsula, bordered by Epirus to the west, Paeonia to the north, the region of Thrace to the east and Thessaly to the south. Chalcidice. Pelagonia. Pieria. Mygdonia. Greek colonies. Magna Graecia. Asia Minor. Aeolis. Doris. Ionia. Bibliography. Homer, The Iliad. Herodotus, The Histories. Pausanias, Description of Greece. Bunsen, Matthew. Encyclopedia of the Roman Empire. New York. Facts on File Inc.